Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the beaches were copper, the pince-nez was golden, and the blaze was silver, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the difference between Holmes's pipes? Or how often he smokes cigars versus cigarettes? Or what Egyptian cigarettes are like?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 315, Pianos. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you all played out after the BSI weekend?
Oh, not at all. I've got fresh rosin on my bow. I've got my tuba all polished. I'm set to go.
Excellent. Well, you would make a fine addition to the cello section of the marching band. You ever see that Woody Allen doing the marching cello?
Yes, I saw that.
Classic.
Yeah.
Classic. This is Trifles, and today we're going to be talking about one very specific musical instrument in the canon, the piano. And I think you'll be interested to hear how this all turns out. I know we will. I can't wait to hear what we have to say. But before we get into that, just wanted to remind you that if you would like to check up on the links for any of the references that we happen to mention in today's episode, you can find those at our SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, most specifically at ihose.co/trifles315. All lowercase. And there you can find those links. You can also subscribe to us on email or by whatever podcast catcher you happen to listen to us on. And of course, there is also the link to our Patreon page, just patreon.com/trifles. And all of our Trifles members are eligible every quarter and every month for the drawings that we do. The monthly drawings give you a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and the quarterly drawings mean that you get a free annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Every single one of our patrons is eligible, so please join the fun. Okay, well, we've talked about music here before, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the episode at the ready. Am I imagining things, or is that actually the case?
Well, these things are mutually exclusive. You are imagining things, but it could also be the case where I should have said they're not mutually exclusive. It could also be the case that we did, in fact, talk about music. I know we've talked about music quite a good deal because we've had some press publications, for example. According to my notes, a wonderful book that we've discussed about music, and I'm sure we've referred to Guy Warwick's book about Sherlock Holmes and music. So I know we've talked about the topic, but I don't know to what degree we've talked about it as a feature of the cases of Sherlock Holmes.
Well, that's a good point because, we did talk about governesses in episode 110. So that is one place where we may have found it. We also talked, of course, about, Holmes and music. We talked about music in the canon very specifically back in, it would have been way back in season 3, I think. That was episodes 139 and 140. We talked at music in the canon, talked about composers. We talked about musicians, instruments, and venues. So we did have a few of these episodes, but here we're talking about one very specific instrument. And it's interesting because I'm going to challenge you, Bert.
Oh, good.
I mean, let's assume you haven't done the assigned reading for this episode. And I said to you, Bert, where would we find a piano mentioned in the Sherlock Holmes stories? What would your mind naturally gravitate toward?
Well, this is one of those questions where the immediate and obvious answer is no place, because it's not, there's never a case of Sherlock Holmes involving a keyboard, a soloist, a particular event, a decisive moment in an investigation that involves really any musical instrument in the canon other than the violin. And one, at least I would, to honestly answer your question, I would say, well, gee, no place. But we know from having done the assignment.
Well, before you get there, I'm going to expose my own bias here, and it comes partly in having been raised in Sherlock Holmes by watching the Granada series almost simultaneously with discovering the short stories. And as you know, the Granada series was pretty faithful to the canon. I would say overall, well, until you get to the later episodes, it was about 85% faithful. And that's an exact number. You can put your money on that. But to me, I would have immediately said in The Solitary Cyclist.
Oh, really?
We have Violet Smith, who, of course, is charged with being a governess for a young lady, Mr. Carruthers' daughter. And she arrives at Baker Street, and we have this wonderful narrative. After she told Holmes that she rode the bicycle a good deal, Watson writes, "My friend took the lady's ungloved hand and examined it with as close an attention and as little a sentiment as a scientist would show to a specimen. You will excuse me, I'm sure. It is my business," said he as he dropped it. "I nearly fell into the error of supposing that you were typewriting. Of course, it is obvious that it is music. You observe the spatulate finger end, Watson, which is common to both professions. There is a spirituality about the face, however." He gently turned it toward the light, "which the typewriter does not generate. This lady is a musician." And she says, "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I teach music." So there's no mention of the piano there, and yet to me, spatulate fingers, Holmes was vacillating between one keyboard or another, the typewriter or what I would assume would be the piano. Because I don't think she would get spatulate fingers from playing the tuba.
Well, no, but she might from the guitar, if she were, for example, Julie Andrews and sitting around the fire as one does in the evening with the Von Trapp family, she might have developed spatulate
Well,
fingers.
if that were the case, though, don't you think Holmes would have told her not to fret? Sorry, I just...
Oh,
Oh, wait, you're telling me she plays the trombone.
you're in very
Yes.
good form today, I see. Very good. Excellent.
Yeah. So to me, and then of course in the Granada series, there are scenes of her teaching young Sarah the piano. So it's always been burned in my brain just to assume that Violet Smith, as a music teacher, was teaching piano. And yet there is no mention of it in that story.
Well, I think that's a very good point. It is odd that among the governesses Holmes encounters, there is very little mention of musical instruction. And as you point out, it's with Violet Smith that we have really the only mention of musical instruction. Because, the music was a favorite form of, I guess, recreation, entertainment in Victorian times. And young ladies were expected to perform at social gatherings and functions. And you could judge in those days, a young woman as to her training and practice by her proficiency in playing the piano, before a genteel audience. And the piano is one of the very few areas where a woman within the constraints of Victorian society could express and distinguish herself. So I think it's a very fair observation.
Yeah, and it's, I think we find it in Copper Beeches as well. Another Violet, in this case, Violet Hunter, is selected as a governess by Jeffro Rucastle. And part of her accomplishments that she lists include a little French, a little German, music, and drawing. Nothing beyond that, though. And clearly, Rucastle was less interested in her role teaching languages or the arts than he was in her, let's just say her placement and her response to his storytelling.
Well, Violet was not particularly forthcoming about the reasons for her departure from the household of Colonel Spence Monroe, but actually scholars have proven that it was because her preferred musical instrument was the harmonica.
I could just picture her playing the blues as if she were in a cell somewhere on a prison block. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, let's take a quick break here, and after we come back, we can talk about the role of piano and music in Victorian households, and then do the big reveal as to where the piano is actually found. Stay with us. Bert, we're just back from the BSI weekend, and of course there were lots of books there available from the BSI Press, but one of the ones that I think is appropriate for this episode is Referring to My Notes, Music and the Sherlockian Canon, edited by Alexander Katz and Karen Wilson. It's one that we covered on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, isn't it?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And you would think that with everything that's been written about the Sherlock Holmes canon, the subject of music has been gone into pretty well. But the wonderful thing about the book is that you learn so much, particularly just off the top of my head, about Holmes and opera. And in fact, Tom Francis, if I remember correctly, has a wonderful article in that book about the opera-going experience of Sherlock Holmes, and in particular, the people he would have encountered, and indeed the people he mentions, the performers, the opera personalities who were on the stage in Victorian England at that time. And it's really, really fascinating in terms of, too, of their repertoire and what they would have performed.
Yeah, and it doesn't end in Sherlock Holmes' time either. I know Linda and Terry Hunt talked about some Baker Street irregulars who were musicians in the past, and then Paul Singleton talked about some musical works that were inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories. So we have life imitating art right there. And as we know, art in the blood is liable to take the strangest of forms. Well, the form it takes in this case is Referring to My Notes, Music in the Sherlockian Canon. You can get your copy from the BSI Press at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, we're back talking about pianos in the canon. More importantly, talking about pianos in Victorian England. You mentioned there, Bert, that this was largely entertainment. When people had dinner parties, when they had guests over, even after regular evening meals, I'm sure they retired to the parlor. And typically in the parlor, they would find the family piano. But the piano as an instrument hadn't really been around all that long by this point. It was first invented, the earlier instance of the piano, of course, was the harpsichord and the pianoforte. But around 1700, craftsman and inventor Bartolomeo Cristofori created a piano for his patron, one of the Medici.
Yes. Well, but the piano had become quite popular. You've had virtuosos like Liszt and Chopin and the great pianists, and particularly in the Victorian age, there were a great many composers who, of course, Beethoven, well before that time period,
Hmm.
had sort of broken new ground in his application of the piano. But you're right in terms of the position in the parlor. By the 19th century, most middle class households in England and America had pianos in their drawing rooms. It was sort of a major entertainment object in the homes of well-functioning middle-class homes for entertaining guests, for the training of children. But the issue there, of course, is that there were Sherlock Holmes encountered a great many people in his clients and cases, but he did not seem to encounter any successful middle-class families who who would have been tinkling the ivories in those days.
No. As a matter of fact, I mean, you think about it, his clients were largely aristocratic, or the criminal class, or the lower class, and quite frankly, the middle class ones he did encounter were largely dysfunctional. I mean, I can't imagine Julius Stoner staying up after dinner to entertain Dr. Grimsby Roylott on the piano.
Well, no, you can. And also, you wonder about the financial security of some households. I was just thinking, I wonder if Conan Doyle had any musical instruction in the piano, because I can't imagine that the stressed home of Charles Foley and in Conan Doyle's own early experience, there was much room for the expense of a piano, much less instruction.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of references, some books that are mentioned in a Wikipedia article, specifically about pianos and women.
Hmm.
And they emphasize a connection during the Victorian period between pianos and the female gender.
Hmm.
Piano study was apparently more common for girls than it was for boys, but the women were discouraged from pursuing it as a profession and encouraged not to take their musical aspirations too seriously. However, at the same time, women, of course, were considered more attractive if and desirable if they could play the piano,
Hmm.
and it became a symbol of the social status, and therefore a condition or the ability to marry a woman off.
Hmm.
They became more attractive as spouses, and they write that women who had learned to play as children often continued to play as adults, thus providing music in their households. For instance, Emma Wedgwood, the granddaughter of the wealthy industrialist Josiah Wedgwood, took piano lessons from none other than Frédéric Chopin, and apparently she achieved a fair level of proficiency. Following her marriage to Charles Darwin, Emma still played the piano daily while her husband listened appreciatively. Except when he was in the Galapagos, I can imagine.
Well, yes, or dealing with any of his physical complaints. Well, you're absolutely right. Women, of course, as we've discussed in the past in Victorian England, were generally thought to be largely ornamental. And in fact, there's a passage in Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Now, of course, that's the early part of the 19th century. That's before 1820. But there's a character there who says of, no, it's Caroline Bingley, who there's this passage where she says, any young woman who considers herself accomplished needs to know music, singing, drawing, dancing, and she
Mm.
has to have something in her air and her manner of walking and the tone of her voice and her address and so on. So this is certainly a feature of literature. But, women too were not taken seriously, as you point out, as performers, instrumentalists, or composers. Look at even Clara Schumann, who,
Yeah, I mean, I think she was really the exception
yeah,
to all that. She stood out, but even then, she was overshadowed by her husband.
her,
So,
yeah.
well,
Well, but we do need to touch on the one appearance of the
that's
piano.
exactly where I was
Yeah,
going.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
please. So tell me, where do we find mention of the piano?
Well, it's amazing. You could walk down a street and hear the notes of music being played occasionally on a fine afternoon. And that's exactly the sort of incident that Holmes and Watson experience. It's from the Bruce Partington plans, where they're on their way somewhere and they get to Caulfield Gardens, one of those lines of flat-faced, pillared, and porticoed houses, which are so prominent, a product of the middle Victorian epoch in the West End of London, as Watson very astutely says. And next door, Watson says, there appeared to be a children's party, for the merry buzz of young voices and the clatter of a piano resounded through the night. And now that's interesting too. The clatter of a piano, tisk, tisk, tisk. Well, I guess Watson didn't have much musical instruction either, but it's one of the only instances, or the few instances, where Holmes and Watson encounter something pleasant as they're going about their work.
Yeah, and I want to call out and this is just a trifle. It's a wonderful scene setting that Conan Doyle has done there. They were on their way to Caulfield Gardens, which is where Hugo Oberstein lived, 13 Caulfield Gardens, Kensington. And you mentioned that next door there appeared to be a children's party. But this was after Watson met Holmes at Goldini's restaurant. And remember, Holmes told him to come at once, join me there, bring with you a jemmy, a dark lantern, a chisel, and a revolver. Right, they're getting ready to break and enter. So my question is, after they had their little gathering together at Goldini's and a coffee and a curacao, right? So they chatted for a bit, and then they walked over to Caulfield Gardens. It probably would have been close to 10, I'm imagining. What kind of a children's party is still going on at 10 p.m.?
Well, that's a very good point.
Yeah. The clatter of the piano. It appeared to be a children's party. The merry buzz of young voices and the clatter of a piano resounded through the night. Well, maybe they were children of, I don't know, lamplighters or, other evening professions.
Well,
Women of the night. I don't
that's
know.
certainly true. But even today, children clamor to stay up late, and this is clearly an instance where there was similar clattering going on with the piano as well as in their clamor. So there you are.
Well, I can tell you one thing. I'll bet the piano player was eager to get to bed.
Well, if so, it's only a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
My accomplishments, sir, may be less than you imagine. A little French, a little German, music, drawing.
Oh, tut, that is quite beside the question.